NinaAllender was a classically trained painter, but Alice convinced her that she needed to become a political cartoonist, which you might think might sound insulting to someone who was a classically trained artist, but NinaAllender talked about how liberating and freeing it was to get your message out through political cartooning.
The women's suffrage movement began in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony held the first Women's Rights Convention. In 1868 and 1870, the 14th and 15th Amendments were ratified, both leaving women out. At the turn of the 20th century, women began marching for suffrage, and a more modern suffrage movement began. Alice Paul and other young militant suffragists were determined to get a constitutional amendment passed. That same year, Paul started the newspaper, The Suffragist. 1 year later, NinaAllender joined the staff of The Suffragist as their cartoonist. In 1919, the U.S. Senate passed the 19th Amendment and the ratification process began. Finally, on August 26, 1920, American women earned the right to vote. This is the story of NinaAllender and her contribution to the women's suffrage movement. Nina Evans Allender was born in Auburn, Kansas on December 25, 1873. Her mother left her father and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1881. Nina's mother, Eva, found a job at the Department of the Interior to support her 2 young daughters. Nina trained as a painter, both locally and abroad. Nina met and married Charlie Allender, but a short time into their marriage, he disappeared from the bank where he worked, along with an untold sum of money and a female companion. Even after their short marriage ended, Nina kept the name Allender. She worked for the Treasury Department and continued painting in hopes of becoming an art teacher. She was also a strong supporter of the women's rights movement.
NinaAllender lived here in Washington, D.C. with her mother, and Alice Paul showed up at their house to solicit donations. She was very good at that, and they tell the story of how, she basically just came into those encounters assuming that you were going to say yes, and both Nina and her mom were kind of bowled over that they had agreed to make a donation. NinaAllender was a classically trained painter, but Alice convinced her that she needed to become a political cartoonist, which you might think might sound insulting to someone who was a classically trained artist, but NinaAllender talked about how liberating and freeing it was to get your message out through political cartooning.
In 1913, Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party began a much more militant campaign for suffrage. They began picketing the White House and planned large suffrage parades. Paul started a weekly newspaper called The Suffragist. The newspaper served important functions for the National Woman's Party. It offered community, communication, and legitimized their cause. It included impassioned reporting, dramatic photographs, editorials, clever illustrations, and emotional first-person accounts by imprisoned suffrage pickets. The Suffragist was staffed by college-educated and professional women who demonstrated their competence in politics and the public sphere. Along with subscriptions, the NWP sold copies of The Suffragist on the street and distributed it to every member of Congress and the White House. Linda Lumsden called it a crusading pioneer of the feminist press. The newspaper began printing NinaAllender's cartoons in June 1914. Her first cartoon depicts a street campaign where attractive young women are shown speaking and handing out suffrage literature. Allender created an image of suffragists that was a sharp contrast to their usual portrayal as drab old maids who were meddling in men's issues. The Allender girl, as she is now called, was young, beautiful, and stepping out of her traditional roles. She was youthful, proud to be a suffragist, and could hold her ground in the political world. Nina's artwork evolved over time, from realistic illustrations, gradually giving way to more symbolic and political cartoons. In her time working for women's rights, she created 297 cartoons.
I think that the imagery that they were portraying was a very important component of affecting public perception of who the suffragists were. That the anti-suffragists often portrayed them as crazy or violent or somehow not real proper women. And the cartoons of NinaAllender are showing this new woman of the 20th century. So she's young and she has stylish hair and sophisticated clothing, but she often has her hands on her hips, her chin up, and she's depicted out in public. So at a time when the story about women is that their sphere is in the home, that their jobs have to do with housekeeping and child care, she hardly ever depicts women. Even women with children are not inside in the house, they're out somewhere. And that was a way of really affirming that women belong in public, that they belong in the political sphere, that this is an appropriate place for them to take their stand. Allender's work seems to more often have women as women right now, wearing the clothes that women wore at the time, involved in situations that would be familiar to the readers, to the audience, of women out in public and encountering the kind of things they would be out in public encountering. Her contribution to this movement was this idea that women needed to be visually striking in a way that got people talking, not in a way that depicted them as in any way of ill repute or not respectable, but to make the argument out in public in the landscape that this is the place where women belong. You make an argument visually that people might be able to dismiss if it was only in words, only in a speech. And by having kind of trademark images like their colors, purple, white, and gold, you were getting the message to people whether they were receptive to it or not. You know, that people seeing the sashes or the purple, white, and gold banners, even if they wouldn't read the words, they would know right away, these are women fighting for the vote. Whether you agreed with them or not, you got the message. These cartoons don't have a say on them. Women belong in the public sphere, women should be enfranchised because women are citizens, but they made that argument just by depicting women that way. And so you saw it and you got the message that that was the place women belonged. Whether if someone argued that with you face to face, you would agree or not, you were getting the message.
Nina's work was to inspire and strengthen the dedication of women who were actively seeking suffrage. In her book, The Story of the Woman's Party, Inez Haynes Gilmore wrote, "Mrs. Allender has a keen political sense, a woman speaking to women about women in the language of women." When Nina Allender died in 1957, the New York Times said she was a cartoonist and artist who campaigned vigorously early in the century for women's suffrage. The Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument located on Capitol Hill, is open Wednesday through Sunday. There are many original Allender cartoons on display on the second floor.
I've been reading in the papers of a very funny land. It's the land where the women wear the trousers, where woman is the boss and poor old man is second hand. In the land where the women wear the trousers, he's got to stop at home all day while she goes out to work. He's got to bath and watch the kids and mind he doesn't shirk. He wears a flannel apron when she's toddling off to work. In the land where the women wear the trousers, in the land where the women wear the trousers. Oh, what a very funny town. No nice girls there walking round the place with golden hair and a pretty little face. They all wear corduroys instead of bits of lace. In the land where the women wear the trousers. In poor old suffragette. I've got a suffragette. My wife's a suffragette. I've heard her jaw and I'm suffering yet. In the land where the women wear the trousers.